Chapter 5. I have spoken of the time I realized physical pain. My first realization of the mental pain of sorrow came when I was 9 years old. I had 2 pet kittens, Catkin and Pussy Willow. Catkin was a little too meek and pink-nosed to suit me, but Pussy Willow was the prettiest, cutest little scrap of gray-striped fur ever seen, and I loved her passionately. One morning I found her dying of poison. I shall never forget my agony of grief as I watched my little pet's bright eyes glazing, and her tiny paws growing stiff and cold. And I never laughed with grown-up wisdom at my passionate sorrow over the little death. It was too real, too symbolical. It was the first time I realized death. The first time, since I had become conscious of loving, that anything I loved had left me forever. At that moment, the curse of the race came upon me. Death entered into my world, and I turned my back on the Eden of childhood, where everything had seemed everlasting. I was barred out of it forevermore by the fiery sword of that keen and unforgettable pain. We were Presbyterians, and we went every Sunday to the old Cavendish Presbyterian Church on the bleak hill. It was never a handsome church, inside or out, but it was beautified in its worshippers' eyes by years of memories and sacred associations. Our pew was by a window, and we looked out over the slope of the long western hill and the blue pond down to the curving rim of the sand hills and the fine sweep of the blue gulf. There was a big gallery at the back of the church. I always hankered to sit there, principally because I wasn't allowed to. No doubt, another instance of forbidden fruit. Once a year, on Sacrament Sunday, I was permitted to go up there with the other girls, and I considered it a great treat. We could look down over the whole congregation, which always flowered out that day in full bloom of new hats and dresses. Sacrament Sunday, then, was to us what Easter is to the dwellers in cities. We all had new hats or dresses. Sometimes, oh bliss, we had both. And I very much fear that we thought more about them than we did about the service and what it commemorated. It was rather a long service in those days, and we small fry used to get very tired and rather inclined to envy certain irresponsible folk who went out while the congregation sang "'Twas on that night when doomed to know." We liked the Sunday school much better than the church services. Some of my sweetest memories are of the hours spent in that old church with my little mates, with our testaments and lesson sheets held in our cotton-gloved hands. Saturday night we had been made learn our catechism and our golden texts and our paraphrases. I always enjoyed reciting those paraphrases, particularly any that had dramatic lines. The London Spectator, in a very kind review of Anne of Green Gables, said that possibly Anne's precocity was slightly overdrawn in the statement that a child of 11 could appreciate the dramatic effect of the lines, "Quick as the slaughtered squadrons fell in Midian's evil day." But I was only 9 when those lines thrilled my very soul as I recited them in Sunday school. All through the sermon following, I kept repeating them to myself. To this day they give me a mysterious pleasure, and a pleasure quite independent of their meaning. So I ran the current of my life in childhood, very quiet and simple, you perceive. Nothing at all exciting about it, nothing that savors of a career. Some might think it dull, but life never held for me a dull moment. I had, in my vivid imagination, a passport to the geography of fairyland. In a twinkling I could, and did, whisk myself into regions of wonderful adventures, unhampered by any restrictions of time or place. Everything was invested with a kind of fairy grace and charm, emanating from my own fancy. The trees that whispered nightly around the old house where I slept, the woodsy nooks I explored, the homestead fields, each individualized by some oddity of fence or shape, the sea whose murmur was never out of my ears, all were radiant with the glory and the dream. I had always a deep love of nature. A little fern growing in the woods, a shallow sheet of June bells under the firs, moonlight falling on the ivory column of a tall birch, an evening star over the old tamarack on the dike, shadow waves rolling over a field of ripe wheat, all gave me thoughts that lay too deep for tears, and feelings which I had then no vocabulary to express. It always seemed to me, ever since early childhood, that, amid all the commonplaces of life, I was very near to a kingdom of ideal beauty. Between it and me hung only a thin veil. I could never draw it quite aside, but sometimes a wind fluttered it and I caught a glimpse of the enchanting realm beyond. Only a glimpse, but those glimpses have always made life worthwhile. It goes without saying that I was passionately fond of reading. We did not have a great many books in the house, but there were generally plenty of papers and a magazine or two. Grandmother took Godey's Lady's Book. I do not know if I would think much of that magazine now, but then I thought it wonderful, and its monthly advents were epochs to me. The opening pages were full of fashion plates and were a perpetual joy. I hung over them with delight, and whiled away many an hour choosing what frocks I would have if I could. Those were the days of bangs, bristols, and high-crowned hats, all of which I considered extremely beautiful and meant to have as soon as I was old enough. Beyond the fashion pages came the literary pabulum, short stories and serials, which I devoured ravenously, crying my eyes out in delicious woe over the agonies of the heroines, who were all superlatively beautiful and good. Everyone in fiction was either black or white in those days. There were no grays. The villains and villainesses were all neatly labeled and you were sure of your ground. The old method had its merits. Nowadays it is quite hard to tell which is the villain and which the hero, but there was never any doubt in Godey's Lady's Book. What books we had were well and often read. I had my especial favorites. There were 2 red-covered volumes of A History of the World, with crudely colored pictures, which were a never-failing delight. I fear that, as history, they were rather poor stuff, but as storybooks they were very interesting. They began with Adam and Eve in Eden, went through the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, down to Victoria's reign. Then there was a missionary book dealing with the Pacific Islands, in which I reveled because it was full of pictures of cannibal chiefs with the most extraordinary hair arrangements. Hans Andersen's tales were a perennial joy. I always loved fairy tales and delighted in ghost stories. Indeed, to this day I like nothing better than a well-told ghost story, warranted to send a cold creep down your spine. But it must be a real ghost story, mark you. The spook must not turn out a delusion and a snare. I did not have access to many novels. Those were the days when novels were frowned on as reading for children. The only novels in the house were Rob Roy, Pickwick Papers, and Bulwer Lytton's Zanoni, and I pored over them until I knew whole chapters by heart. Fortunately, poetry did not share the ban of novels. I could revel at will in Longfellow, Tennyson, Whittier, Scott, Byron, Milton, Burns. Poetry pored over in childhood becomes part of one's nature more thoroughly than that which if first read in mature years can ever do. Its music was woven into my growing soul and has echoed through it, consciously and subconsciously, ever since. The music of the immortals, of those great, beautiful souls whose passing tread has made of earth holy ground. But even poetry was barred on Sundays. Then our faithful standbys were Pilgrim's Progress and Talmage's Sermons. Pilgrim's Progress was read and reread with never-failing delight. I am proud of this, but I am not quite so proud of the fact that I found just as much delight in reading Talmage's Sermons. That was Talmage's palmy day. All the traveling colporteurs carried his books, and a new volume of Talmage's meant then to us pretty much what a bestseller does now. I cannot claim that it was the religion that attracted me, though at that age I liked the Talmage brand much. It was the anecdotes and the vivid, dramatic word pictures. His sermons were as interesting as fiction. I am sure I couldn't read them with any patience now, but I owe Talmage a very real debt of thanks for pleasure given to a child craving the vividness of life. My favorite Sunday book, however, was a thin little volume entitled The Memoir of Anzonetta Peters. I shall never forget that book. It belonged to a type now vanished from the earth, fortunately, but much in vogue at that time. It was the biography of a child who at 5 years became converted, grew very ill soon afterward, lived a marvelously patient and saintly life for several years, and died, after great sufferings, at the age of 10. I must have read that book 100 times if I did once. I don't think it had a good effect on me. For one thing, it discouraged me horribly. Anzonetta was so hopelessly perfect that I felt it was no use to try to imitate her. Yet I did try. She never seemed, by any chance, to use the ordinary language of childhood at all. She invariably responded to any remark, if it were only, "How are you today, Anzonetta?" by quoting a verse of scripture or a hymn stanza. Anzonetta was a perfect hymnal. She died to a hymn, her last, faintly whispered utterance being, "Hark, they whisper, angels say, Sister Spirit, come away." I dared not attempt to use verses and hymns in current conversation. I had a wholesome conviction that I should be laughed at, and, moreover, I doubted being understood. But I did my best. I wrote hymn after hymn in my little diary, and patterned the style of my entries after Anzonetta's remarks. For example, I remember writing gravely, "I wish I were in heaven now, with Mother and George Whitefield and Anzonetta B. Peters." But I didn't really wish it. I only thought I ought to. I was, in reality, very well contented with my own world, and my own little life full of cabbages and kings. End of chapter 5.